They called me a murderer. And in that moment, as the heavy, dirty word clung to me, I could only think of one thing. The face of my daughter, Lily. The real murderer, however, sat in the front row, dressed in mourning, with perfectly practiced pain in her eyes. I saw her smile, a barely perceptible movement of her lips, just as the cold metal of the handcuffs closed around my wrists. "Come on, murderer," a guard growled, pushing me forward. "Your new home awaits." Truth, however, is a silent thing, and mine traveled with me, locked in my chest, as the last image of New York faded against the dirty, barred glass of the bus. Every light outside was a life, a miracle of noise and movement that now receded from me, like the tide retreating from the sand. The bus rocked, a sick metal animal, and the smell was a mixture of disinfectant, fearful sweat, and the metallic odor of hopelessness itself. The clanking of the chains brought me back to my aunt's smile, to her silent victory. She had built my prison long before I was condemned, a cell made of whispers, lies, and my own naive trust. That metallic sound of the Bedford Hills gates closing was the true end. Not the judge's gavel, not the word guilty. It was the clang of steel sealing my fate. In that instant, hope became just another word in the dictionary. Justice, I realized, was not a scale, but an iron door closing. And I wondered if my aunt, from her luxurious tomb, could hear that sound, and if, somehow, she was still smiling at the success of her last, cruelest work of fiction. The admissions process was a lesson in how to strip a soul. In a cold, white room, under buzzing lights, the order came, dry and impersonal. Take everything off. The clothes, the shoes, the dignity. They handed me a blue uniform, rough as sandpaper, scratching my skin, a constant reminder of where I was. Every personal item was placed in a plastic bag, my ring, my watch, and lastly, Lily's photo, the small, faded image with her 7-year-old smile and one missing tooth. My gospel, my map. When the guard reached for it, I recoiled. "It's my daughter," I whispered. "You can't," she replied. The moment her fingers touched the paper, a wild animal impulse rose in my throat, the desire to sink my teeth into her hand, to fight like a cornered animal. It was a flash of fury, a last act of resistance. But it lasted only a second. Reality crushed me. I was inmate 734. She snatched the photo from my hand, and I watched helplessly as she tossed it into the bag with the rest of my belongings, an artifact of a lost civilization. When they led us to the cell corridor, I was no longer Genevieve. I was a number. The name my mother had given me had been sealed in that plastic bag along with a photo of a smiling face. The loss of that image wasn't just the loss of an object. It was the confiscation of my purpose. Without Lily's face to guide me, who would I become in that place? The question echoed in the corridor, a dark prophecy disguised as doubt. The cell was a concrete box, 2 meters wide, 3 meters long, a metal bunk bed, a sink, and a steel toilet. I lay down on the thin mattress and listened to the prison's nocturnal symphony. Distant crying, the guard's footsteps, the sound of someone praying in a fervent whisper, a private negotiation with a God who seemed to have forgotten the address. The silence between the sounds was the worst part. It was a heavy silence, pressing on the eardrums, full of everything that could not be said. The first wave of panic hit like a thief. My heart raced. The small cell seemed to shrink. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to ground myself, and began repeating the only truth I had left. My name is Genevieve. My daughter's name is Lily. I whispered the words into the darkness, faster and faster like an incantation. But instead of comfort, the words began to unravel. The name, Genevieve, became a strange sound in my mouth, a collection of syllables with no connection to the trembling woman lying on that bunk. In that darkness, at the depths of despair, something shifted. The panic subsided, and in its place emerged a clarity as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. The body might be trapped, but the mind was mine. My aunt had used stories to imprison me, transforming me into a villain in her final act. But she had forgotten a fundamental lesson of literature. Every story can be retold. There, on that cold bunk, a silent promise was born. I would write to Lily. Letters in my mind, a library of memories and truths I would save for the day when freedom was no longer an empty word. This cell would not be my tomb. It would be my blank page. Fear gave way to an icy determination, a strength I didn't know I possessed. I wouldn't fight the iron bars. I would transform them into lines in a notebook. My aunt had given me a life sentence, but unbeknownst to me, she had also given me the subject of my masterpiece. I took my first deep breath since arriving, the air still fetid, but now bearable. And in the darkness of my first night, the first sentence of my first letter to Lily formed, clear and unshakable, in my mind. My dear Lily, every great story begins in darkness, not to celebrate the shadows, but to teach us to find the light. The first morning in Bedford Hills didn't dawn. It exploded. A shrill alarm ripped through the silence, followed by the metallic sound of hundreds of cell locks being opened in unison. Fluorescent lights flickered, bathing the corridor in a cold, sickly light that was unforgiving. The concrete floor was icy beneath my bare feet, a shock that jolted me from my torpor. The air smelled of weak coffee, disinfectant, and the collective smell of bodies sleeping in a confined space. The symphony of the previous night, with its whispers and fears, was replaced by a cacophony of shouted orders, coughs, and the unison of shuffling feet. It was the prison machine turning on, a monster waking for another day of devouring time. We were lined up in the hallway for the count. The procedure was mechanical, humiliating. Hands behind our backs, eyes forward. I watched the other women's faces. They were masks of resignation, maps of ancient tragedies. No one looked each other in the eye. Eye contact was too precious a currency to be spent without reason. In the cafeteria, the noise was deafening. Metal trays clanged, conversations were low and urgent, the sound of plastic cutlery scraping against metal plates. The food was a gray, tasteless paste, but I ate. Each bite was an act of survival, a concession to the new reality. My body needed to keep going, even if my soul wanted to give up. I understood that first morning that time in prison doesn't move forward. It moves in circles. The alarm, the counting, the food, the work, the confinement, the silence, the alarm again. It was an endless repetition, designed to grind away at individuality until only the dust of obedience remained. The loss of freedom wasn't about not being able to leave. It was about not being able to choose even the next thought that wasn't dictated by routine. I wondered how many mornings like this I would have to endure until the memory of a different awakening, with the smell of real coffee and the sound of Lily's laughter, was completely erased. In my second week, I was assigned a job. When I read the order on the clipboard, a shiver ran through me, a mixture of dread and a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Library service. The place was a forgotten annex at the end of a seldom-used hallway, a small room with crooked metal shelves and a single barred window through which sunlight streamed in a dusty shaft. The smell of old paper and mildew was so familiar it hurt. She was the ghost of my old life, an echo of the woman I used to be. Books with torn covers, yellowed pages, broken spines. It was a collection of wounded stories, a hospital for abandoned words. The person in charge was a woman named Maria, a lifer who had been there for over 20 years. She moved with a calm that only time and acceptance can grant. "Don't get attached to them," she said, her voice low and husky, as she watched me run my fingers along the spine of a worn edition of Anna Karenina. "They're not yours. Nothing here is." His words were a warning, but I barely heard them. I touched those books like a hungry man touches bread. I found a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, my aunt's favorite book. The ironies of life, even here, lost none of their cruelty. I held the volume in my hands, its familiar weight, and the promise I'd made to myself that first night ceased to be a delusion. There, in that sanctuary of broken stories, I realized that the library wasn't just a refuge. It was an arsenal. Every book, every plot, every character was a tool. My aunt had trapped me with a false narrative, a fiction of greed and murder. I would use the world's greatest fictions to tell my truth. Maria was wrong. Those books might not be mine, but their stories, their secrets, their plots of revenge, redemption, and justice now belonged to me in a way she would never understand. The faith I had lost in humankind, I found again in words. They would be my salvation. That night, the darkness of the cell was no longer frightening. It was a blank canvas, a sacred space for my silent insurrection. My cellmate, a young woman imprisoned for a crime she never discussed, was already asleep, her breathing a soft, rhythmic sound in the silence. I closed my eyes and began writing my first mental letter to Lily. I spoke of the sky I saw through the bus window, of how the stars looked different through the bars, but were still the same stars that watched over her sleep. It was a love letter, a bridge of memory built over an abyss of loss. Then I began working on the other letter, the letter to Mr. Harrison, my old literature professor at the university, a retired man who had become my only friend and correspondent in the outside world. It would be a seemingly innocent letter about my adaptation and my readings. But to him, it would be a code. Using the plot of The Count of Monte Cristo, I began to tell my story. "Dear Professor," I dictated in my mind, "I met an old friend here, Edmond Dantes. The fortress of If is exactly as Dumas described. I keep thinking of Fernand Mondego, how betrayal can be the most perfect prison, far more effective than stone walls. My aunt always admired the precision of such plans. That act of creation was the first breath of true freedom I felt. Each coded word was one less brick in my wall of despair. I was no longer inmate 734, the murderous niece. I was the narrator, the architect of a hidden truth. Redemption, I knew, would not come from a parole board. It would come from that secret correspondence, from the certainty that one person in the world would know the truth. The forgiveness I sought was not from society, but from myself, for having been blind for so long. And my hook, the sentence that would make Mr. Harrison understand everything, would be my signature. I remember what you always said. The best revenge is not fire, it's clarity. Sincerely, your student, Genevieve. The days became a blur of routine, but the nights were mine. During the day, I was a shadow, a silent observer of the prison's brutal ecosystem. I learned to read the silences, to understand the hierarchies that formed in the cafeteria, the alliances and betrayals that happened with the exchange of a glance. I saw the cruelty born of fear, and I saw gestures of kindness so unexpected they seemed like miracles. A woman sharing her last biscuit, another braiding the hair of a new girl who wept with loneliness. It was a world of unwritten codes, a complex society born under the constant pressure of surveillance and loss. One afternoon, in the courtyard, I watched a fight erupt over a spot on a bench in the sun. There were no shouts, just a quick shove, a cold stare, and the silent capitulation of the weaker one. Later, back in the cell, my cellmate, who had witnessed the scene, said to me quietly, without looking at me, "Here, you don't fight for the sun. You fight for the shade. It's safer not to be seen." That advice, coming from a girl who barely spoke, was the most important lesson I learned. To survive, I needed to become invisible. A ghost librarian, cataloging not just books, but the lost souls around me. That night, I reflected on the truth of those words. Invisibility was power. It was what allowed me to write my secret letters, what protected me from the predators that roamed the corridors. Each woman there had a story, a betrayal, a moment when her life was torn in two. I wasn't alone in my tragedy, only in its details. The prison, with its bars and barbed wire, was the frame. But the painting, the true work of art of pain, was the story each carried within. And I wondered, how many other secret narrators existed in those cells, rewriting their destinies in the silence of their minds? The paper was thin and rough, the pencil short and blunt. Even so, the sensation of holding a writing tool, of preparing to leave a physical mark on the world, was such a dizzying luxury that my hands trembled. I hid in a corner of the library, a niche between the history and philosophy shelves that had become my private office. The smell of dust and paper was my shield, the silence of the place my armor. Writing the first letter to Mr. Harrison was like trying to build a ship in a bottle. Every word had to be perfect, every sentence a work of double engineering, innocent on the surface, but laden with the weight of my hidden truth. I described the prison library, calling it an archive of forgotten souls, a phrase I knew he would appreciate. I talked about finding the copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, and how the story of such profound injustice brought me a strange comfort. And so, I wove the code, the message meant only for him. My aunt, who so admired the cunning of Dumas's villains, would have appreciated the perfection with which the trap was set. She always said that the best betrayal is the one the victim never fully understands. Handing the sealed letter over for inspection by the guards was an act of blind faith. I watched as the officer opened it, his eyes scanning my words with bureaucratic boredom. For a moment, I held my breath. He was reading my secret confession, my accusation, and he saw nothing. The letter was a seed, a tiny particle of truth sent to the outside world. But, inside, waiting for its germination, was a form of torture. The days dragged on again in their circular, crushing routine. Hope, once kindled, was now a fragile ember I needed to protect from the constant wind of despair. With each day without a response, the doubt grew. Had he understood? Or had my metaphor been too subtle, lost in a letter that sounded only like the solitary ramblings of a literate prisoner? Justice, I realized, depended not on grand gestures, but on small miracles of communication. On one mind understanding another across an abyss of silence. It was in the library, my only sanctuary, that my disguise of invisibility began to crumble. I felt it before I saw it. It was a shift in the atmosphere, a cool draft in a place that had always been stagnant. It was the sensation of being watched, not by the guards, whose gaze was part of the architecture, but by a watchful intelligence. The eyes belonged to Eleonora, a 60-year-old woman who commanded the prison's respect not with muscles, but with a piercing silence and a gaze that seemed to see through cell walls and souls. She never raised her voice, never got into fights. She didn't need to. Her power was intellectual. One day, as I was cataloging a new donation of paperbacks, she approached my desk. She picked up the copy of Crime and Punishment that I had set aside for my next letter. "Dostoevsky," she said, her voice surprisingly soft, but with a steely timbre. "A man who understood that true punishment comes not from the judge, but from the mind itself. That guilt is the perfect prison from which there is no escape." She looked me straight in the eye, and for the first time in months, I couldn't look away. "You like stories about wronged men, librarian. Dumas, Dostoevsky. Do you look for mirrors or maps?" My blood ran cold. The question wasn't casual. It was a check. My carefully woven invisibility cloak had been pierced. Eleonora didn't just see a quiet prisoner. She saw a pattern, a mind at work, a secret. She was a chess player in a world of checkers, and she had just recognized me as a piece worthy of her attention. The danger she posed was far greater than any physical violence. It was the danger of being misunderstood by the wrong person. What did she want? Information? Power? Or was she just a curious soul, bored with the intellectual mediocrity of prison? Her question hung in the air, a sharp hook waiting to hook my truth. Eleonora's analytical presence, her way of dismantling my motivations with a single question, threw me back to another library, another controlling presence. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was in my aunt's library, a sumptuous, lifeless place where books were decoration and silence was a weapon. The air smelled of beeswax and her expensive gardenia perfume. It was the smell of my gilded cage, a place the world saw as a privilege, but for me was a prison of expectations and subtle control. I was 22 years old, and clutching an acceptance letter from a university in another city, a graduate program that was my dream, my ticket to freedom. My aunt read the letter, and a thin smile, identical to the one she would give in court years later, touched her lips. "How wonderful, my dear," she said. "But think about it. The world out there is so vulgar. You are a delicate creature, Genevieve. Your place is here, safe, with me, taking care of these stories." 2 weeks later, a polite letter withdrawing my candidacy was sent, forged with my signature. When I confronted her, she hugged me. "I did it out of love, my dear, to protect you. I took care of everything." At that moment, in the prison library, the truth hit me with blinding clarity. Bedford Hills wasn't my first prison. It was simply the most honest. My aunt's betrayal wasn't just framing me for her death. It was a lifetime of silent sabotage, of murdering my autonomy, all disguised as protective love. Her staged suicide wasn't an act of desperation. It was her final, masterful move of control, ensuring that even after death, she would still possess me, define me. I wasn't convicted of a crime I didn't commit. I was convicted of a crime she spent her entire life committing against me, the theft of my freedom. The post office routine was a ritual of hope and disappointment. Every day at 4 in the afternoon, a guard would walk down the corridor shouting the names of the lucky ones. Most days it was a parade of names that weren't mine. But 3 weeks after I'd mailed my letter, in the depths of my despair, after the confrontation with Eleonora and the painful memory of my aunt, I heard it. Inmate 734. Genevieve. My heart sank. The letter was thin, the envelope official. The handwriting was Mr. Harrison's. With trembling hands, I opened it in my cell. The letter was a model of normalcy. He talked about his garden, about a problem with aphids on his roses, about the cold weather. It felt like the reply of an old friend politely responding to a letter from an acquaintance in trouble but unwilling to get involved. My stomach sank. He hadn't understood. The seed had died in the soil. I read to the end, feeling the weight of my loneliness return with full force. And then I saw it. At the bottom of the page, almost like an afterthought, a postscript. P.S., it read. Your words about Dumas inspired me. I decided to reread it. The Count of Monte Cristo? It's been a long time since I visited the Château d'If. Sometimes the oldest stories hold the most important keys, don't you think? The miracle. The tear that ran down my face wasn't of sadness, but of a relief so deep it was almost painful. He understood. The key had been received. The door wasn't open, but for the first time, I knew there was a lock and that someone on the other side was willing to try to turn it. I was no longer alone. I had an ally. And now, the real game of my redemption could begin. The library was no longer the same. After Mr. Harrison's response, the air seemed to vibrate with a new, dangerous energy. My sanctuary had become a chessboard, and the silence, once a refuge, was now the tense space between the movements of two players. I felt Eleonora's eyes on me constantly, not with the threat of a predator, but with the appraising curiosity of a master craftswoman examining a complex tool. My invisibility was a distant memory. I was a ghost suddenly forced into materialization, and I discovered that exposure was far colder than solitude. A week after the letter arrived, Eleonora cornered me in the Russian classics aisle. She said nothing for a long moment, just ran her finger along the spine of a book. Hope is a dangerous drug in this place, librarian, she said, her voice as calm as ever. It makes you careless. It makes you believe the rules don't apply. Then she made her move. I see how you look at the post office gate. I see the disappointment and I see the relief. You have a thread connected to the outside world, a thread strong enough to pull out secrets. The guards read your letters, but they don't understand them. I understand. I understand that you're doing something. Her proposal came next, direct and blunt. She could ensure my letters would leave and arrive without the guards' inspection, using a network of trust and debt she had spent decades building. The price? I would have to be her carrier pigeon to the outside world. There's a woman here, she said, convicted of a fire. She swears it was faulty wiring. Ask your friend, your teacher, to look up the original report from the county fire inspector. A small favor. It was a pact with the devil dressed in a prison uniform. The offer accelerated all my plans, a fast track to justice, but it would chain me to Eleonora, to her secrets and her debts. To refuse would be to place myself in her crosshairs. To accept would be to drown in her waters. I looked at her face, at the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of an intelligence forged in suffering, and I saw a distorted mirror of myself, a woman using her mind as her only weapon. In that moment, I understood that redemption sometimes requires getting one's hands dirty. I will do it, I replied, and the weight of that new alliance settled upon me, as real and heavy as the bars of my cell. Amidst this dangerous game of secrets and alliances, a small flower of humanity began to blossom in the barren soil of the library. It was Rosa, the girl who had cried on the bus my first night. She was nearly illiterate, able to recognize only a few words, and moved through the world with her head down, ashamed of a deficit that was not her fault. She began coming to the library, not to read, but to look at the pictures in children's books, tracing the images with her finger, hungry for stories she could not decipher. I felt a pang of purpose that went beyond my own struggle, an echo of the librarian I once was. I began teaching her. Secretly, in the back of the library, we used old primers and picture books. It was slow, frustrating work. For every step forward, there seemed to be two back. But Rosa had a quiet tenacity. One afternoon, while we were reading a simple book about a bird learning to fly, she stopped, pointed to the page, and read, without my help, the entire sentence. The bird flies home. Her eyes filled with tears, and a smile, the first I had ever seen her give, lit up her face. In that instant, the noise of the prison, Eleonora's presence, the weight of my own sentence, all disappeared. That small miracle was an act of redemption. In a place designed to break the spirit, we were building something. Teaching Rosa to read was my most significant rebellion, an act of faith in the transformative power of words. It was a reminder of why my own truth mattered. It wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about the fundamental belief that every soul has the right to its own story, to read it, to write it, to own it. That small victory, the freedom of a single sentence, gave me more strength than any plan for revenge. And across the room, I saw Eleonora watching us. But this time, her gaze held no suspicion. There was something more, something that resembled respect. With Eleonora's new secure communication route, the next letter to Mr. Harrison was different. I felt the weight and power in every word I wrote. The risk was greater, but so was the possibility of success. This time, the code was built around And There Were None Left by Agatha Christie. I described my aunt's suicide as the most perfect of locked room crimes. A puzzle designed to have only one apparent solution: my guilt. And then, I gave her the key. The victim, as in so many novels, kept a diary. She was vain about her first editions. Look in the copy of The Scarlet Letter. She always said that Hester Prynne was the only character in literature who understood the weight of an open secret. I think she would have hidden hers there. I handed the folded letter to a woman working in the laundry, one of Eleonora's lieutenants. Watching her disappear amidst piles of dirty uniforms was a terrifying and liberating act of detachment. I had sent the map to the treasure, the location of the truth. I was no longer just a victim narrating her tragedy. I was a detective behind bars, directing an investigation hundreds of miles away. But this new agency came with the bitter taste of debt. I had used Eleonora's power. Soon, she would come to collect. Hope now had an accomplice, and I didn't know if that made it stronger or infinitely more fragile. The answer came faster than I dared dream. Less than a week later, the laundress delivered an envelope along with my clean clothes. Mr. Harrison's letter, which arrived via Eleonora's channel, was bolder, the smokescreen of normalcy thinner. He wrote about visiting a fascinating curio shop to find a book for his collection. And then came the confirmation, the sentence that stopped my world from spinning. "The first edition of Hawthorne I mentioned is extraordinary," he wrote. "The former owner's notes in the margins and on the blank pages at the end are, in fact, more fascinating than the story itself. A stunning testament. I believe a handwriting expert would find the material of great interest." He found it. The diary, the confession, the proof. A wave of triumph and relief so powerful hit me that I had to sit down on my bunk, afraid my legs would give way. It was real. Freedom, once an abstract concept, a distant memory, suddenly became a tangible possibility, a point of light at the end of a dark tunnel. It was proof that the soul can, indeed, pass through bars. But when I looked up, I saw Eleonora standing in the hallway, watching me through the crack in the cell door. There was a small smile on her lips, a smile that said, "Excellent news. Now let's talk about that fire report. You owe me." My greatest victory had just become my greatest debt. The debt to Eleonora was a cold and constant presence in my cell, a ghost sitting at the foot of my bunk. The library, once my safe haven, was now the center of a web of intrigue, and I was the fly that had consented to enter. The freedom of communication Eleonora had given me was, in fact, a new collar, more subtle and perhaps stronger than iron chains. I felt the weight of my commitment in every look we exchanged, in every calculated silence. She had given me a key, but now I belonged to her lock. Writing the next letter to Mr. Harrison was an act of profound moral corruption. I had to involve the only man I trusted in the prison's sordid power politics. I disguised Eleonora's request as academic curiosity, a book club colleague's interest in arson cases and the fallibility of investigations. I asked him to look for the report of a specific fire that had occurred a decade ago. Every word I wrote felt like a betrayal of the purity of my own quest for justice. I delivered the letter to Eleonora's messenger, feeling dirty, as if I had sold a piece of my soul for a shortcut. I had become a player in the prison game, using the same tactics of manipulation and favor trading that I despised. The line between victim seeking justice and accomplice involved in other people's schemes had become dangerously thin. To save myself, was I becoming a version of those women I'd observed with such detachment in the beginning? The question haunted me through the long nights, a dark echo that questioned whether the price of freedom wouldn't be the loss of who I was. Mr. Harrison's response arrived, and with it, chaos. The report he found, the details of which he transmitted to me in code, mentioned a history of electrical problems in the burned-out building, information conveniently ignored at trial. As soon as I relayed the gist of the discovery to Eleonora, shockwaves spread through the prison. The woman she had been helping, a quiet woman everyone thought was wasting away without hope, suddenly had a weapon for a new appeal. Her main rival in the block, a woman who controlled the cigarette smuggling and favors, sensed the shift in power immediately. A violent brawl broke out in the laundry room 2 days later. It wasn't for an obvious reason, but everyone knew it was a message. The woman from the fire was accidentally pushed, her arm broken in the melee. I was marked. The looks I received now weren't of indifference, but of hostility. I was the ghost who suddenly had a body and an affiliation. I was Eleonora's woman. I realized the chilling truth of her plan. It wasn't about altruism or justice, it was about power. The information I provided was leverage, a way to destabilize a rival and cement her own control over the prison's fragile ecosystem. The fire of the past had ignited a new fire in Bedford Hills, and I was at its center. My search for the truth had been used to fuel someone else's ambitions. I was a pawn in a game far older and more complex than my own tragedy. The taste of complicity was bitter, a feeling that, in trying to free myself, I had helped tighten someone else's bars. I had blood on my hands, even if it was only the figurative blood of a fight in the laundry room. What would happen when Eleonora decided I was no longer useful, or worse, that I was a threat? Amidst this turmoil, the answer I had truly hoped for, the news about my aunt's diary, finally arrived. Mr. Harrison's letter was hidden inside a gardening book Eleonora had procured for me. His words, however, shook the ground from under my feet. He had taken the diary to a lawyer friend of his. The news was devastating. The diary was useless. My aunt, in her final act of perverse genius, had written not a confession, but a piece of literature. She spoke of staging a final act worthy of a Greek tragedy and of casting the perfect villain to make the drama meaningful. The lawyer had been clear. To a court, this was not a confession of suicide, but the poetic, self-centered ramblings of a wealthy, depressed woman. It was art, not evidence. The irrefutable proof was a mirage. My aunt had defeated me once again, from the grave. Her cruelty was so exquisite, so artfully veiled, that it had become legally invisible. The hope that had sustained me for months disintegrated, turning to ash. The dark tunnel had no light at the end. It was just a tunnel. Freedom was not a possibility. It was a sick joke. I sat on my bunk, the silence of the cell swallowing me, and for the first time since I arrived, I truly and truly gave up. The ultimate betrayal was not what she did, but how she ensured that the truth, even when found, held no power. I spent days in a daze, completing my assignments like an automaton. The spark within me had gone out. It was Rosa, my reading student, who pulled me back from the brink, without even knowing it. We were in the library, and she was struggling through a simple fable. The fox didn't want the grapes, she spelled out, frowning. She said they were bad because she couldn't reach them. She looked at me, confused. She lied, didn't she? Just to avoid appearing weak. And then, something clicked in my mind. The simplicity of that childish logic, that face-saving lie, collided with Mr. Harrison's words about the diary, casting the perfect villain so the drama would make sense. The pieces fell into place in a blinding, horrifying epiphany. I'd been looking at the puzzle the wrong way. I was looking for proof of suicide, but that was never the main story. Suicide was merely the method. The masterpiece, the real crime, was the setup. My aunt didn't kill herself and, as a secondary act, framed me. She killed herself. Toto framed me. My destruction wasn't a consequence. It was the goal. Her death wasn't the end of her life. It was the beginning of my life sentence. It was her final, eternal act of control, her way of ensuring that her presence would dominate my life forever. She wasn't the sad queen in the fairy tale. She was the author who wrote herself into a victim so she could turn me into a monster. A chill ran through me, but it wasn't of fear. It was of clarity. I finally understood the plot. The forgiveness I needed to seek wasn't from the law or society. It was forgiveness for myself, for failing to see that the luxurious house where I grew up had always been a prison, and that my aunt had always been my jailer. The diary wasn't useless. We were reading it wrong. It wasn't a suicide with a poetic note. It was the premeditation of a psychological murder with the author detailing her motive. And the motive wasn't grief. It was possession. I knew, with a certainty that made me tremble, what I needed to tell Mr. Harrison. It wasn't about proving she killed herself anymore. It was about proving because she wanted the world to believe that I killed her. The clarity I found in the darkness of my cell was a cold, precise weapon. The fear, the pain, the fragile hope, all of it merged into a single, unshakable certainty. I was no longer adrift. I was the captain of a ship that, though damaged, now had a map and a destination. I sat in my corner of the library, no longer a hiding place, but a command center, and prepared my final offensive. The last letter to Mr. Harrison would be the most important of my life, the key that would unlock not only my cell, but also the psychological tomb where my aunt had tried to bury me alive. This time, I didn't hide behind the plot of a single book. Instead, I wove a tapestry from all the codes we'd used. "Dear Professor," I wrote, with a firm hand I didn't recognize as my own, "do you remember our conversation about Dantes, Raskolnikov, and Christie's locked room murders? We were looking at them as stories of men seeking justice or redemption. We were wrong." I explained my epiphany, the simple, monstrous truth. My aunt's diary is not a victim's confession. It is an author's manifesto. Tell the lawyers to stop trying to prove suicide. Tell them to prove murder, a murder of the soul, with the diary as premeditated proof of motive. The crime was not her death. The crime was me. I handed the letter to Eleonora, not as a debtor, but as an equal, a sovereign of my own little kingdom of truth. My final act in the prison chess game had been executed. I had moved my queen. Now all I could do was wait, but it was a different kind of wait. It wasn't the anxious waiting of a victim, but the patient waiting of a strategist. The wait itself was proof of my transformation. I had learned to inhabit time rather than be devoured by it. Freedom, I now understood, was not a place one goes to, but a state of being one builds, even in the most confined of spaces. A few days later, Eleonora met me in the courtyard. The afternoon sun was weak, but she positioned herself so her shadow wouldn't fall on me. There was a new respect in her gaze, the admiration of a master for an apprentice who had surpassed expectations. "The fire," she said, "will have a new trial. The woman you helped has a chance." She paused, looking at the distant walls. "I spent 40 years in here. I was betrayed by my own brother, out of greed. He put me here. I learned early that in this place, you don't survive on hope. You survive on control. You control information, favors, fear. It's the only currency that matters." She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the crack in her steel armor, the ancient pain that had shaped her. "But you," she continued, "you didn't seek control over others. You sought control over your own story. It's a more subtle move, and a more powerful one." She handed me a small package of cookies from the commissary, a gift that, in prison code, was a peace treaty and a sign of deep respect. "Your debt is paid, librarian. Some keys aren't meant to open doors. They only serve to show us the exact shape of the lock that holds us." In that moment, I felt a surge of empathy for that woman, a soul imprisoned by a betrayal so profound that she rebuilt her own fortress from within. Forgiveness, I realized, was acknowledging the other's imprisonment. A week later, my name was called for a legal visit. The air in the visiting room was the same, sterile and lifeless. But something was different. The lawyer sitting across the metal desk from me wasn't the overworked public defender I knew. She was a woman with sharp, tender eyes, sent by Mr. Harrison. She placed her briefcase on the desk and looked at me with an intensity that made me catch my breath. "Genevieve," she said, the first person in years to use my name with any semblance of normalcy. "We did exactly as you instructed. We presented the diary not as a suicide note, but as a blueprint for psychological abuse and posthumous control." She explained that by recontextualizing the diary with Mr. Harrison's testimony about my aunt's controlling personality and a history of her sabotaging actions, they painted a picture the prosecution could not ignore. The truth was so perverse, so Machiavellian, that it was more believable than a simple story about a greedy niece. "The prosecution has agreed to reopen the investigation," the lawyer said, and then uttered words that seemed to come from another universe. "They are dropping all charges against you. The release process will begin immediately. You are free." The words floated through the room, surreal and distant. The victory was not a thunderclap, but a whisper. Justice arrived not with a sword, but with the correct interpretation of a text. The day of my release was gray, with a light rain washing the concrete walls of Bedford Hills. Putting on my own clothes was like stepping into a stranger's skin. As I walked down the last aisle, I saw Rosa in the library window. She held a book, and when our eyes met, she smiled and waved. I nodded back, a silent promise that the stories we'd shared would continue. I walked through the gates that had once slammed shut like the lid of a coffin. The sound they made as they opened wasn't triumphant. It was just the sound of metal moving. The air outside smelled of wet earth and chimney smoke, a complexity of aromas that almost made me dizzy. I took my first steps into a world I no longer recognized. But as Mr. Harrison's car pulled away from the prison, I knew one unshakable truth. My true liberation hadn't happened then. It happened months ago, in the darkness of my cell, with the promise of a letter. It happened in the library, among wounded books. It happened when I understood the nature of my prison and the identity of my true jailer. The bars of Bedford Hills were merely a metaphor for the invisible walls my aunt had built around me her entire life. And I had already scaled those walls, word by word. My soul was already free. The rest was just bureaucracy. That night, in the quiet guest room of Mr. Harrison's house, a place that smelled of old books and chamomile tea, the very definition of home, I sat at a wooden desk. The light from a lamp cast a golden glow on a sheet of cream-colored stationery. I picked up a real pen, felt its weight, the way the ink flowed, smooth and dark. And I began to write the first real letter, the first of many, to the person who was my one true north. The first letter that would be sealed in an envelope and delivered by a mailman, a miracle of normalcy. "My dear Lily," I wrote, "every great story begins in darkness. Ours is no different. But now, for the first time, we are writing in the sunlight." I didn't ask for mercy. I asked for a blank page to rewrite my story. Sometimes writing both condemns and liberates. For me, pain wasn't the end. It was the path. The number 734 wasn't a label, but the encounter between the victim and the narrator of my own story. What is truth when bars make it invisible? If you've ever felt hostage to a story that wasn't yours, share it with those who need to pick up the pen again. Your presence here strengthens my voice. Subscribe to continue meeting us in each new story.